Rebellion. Remember it? We're going to get into some juicy tidbits here in a minute, but let me state up front that rebellion has its purpose. It's the counter to everybody's homemade ogre that says, we're not doing it different. We're doing it the same way because that's the way we've always done it. We don't need that. Things need to change. And before we talk about Lincoln's rebellion, I want to talk a little bit about mine when I was a teenager. Because I rebelled, and actually, you know, Lincoln didn't rebel like I did. I wonder, what was wrong with him? I just kidding. No, in my case, some of you who have known me for a while may recognize this characteristic, that there's something of the dramatic flair to my teenage rebellion, at least in my own feverish, acne-driven imagination. In my case, I always wanted to do this. I didn't do it, but I always wanted to, and I'm going to do it today in my 70s. What I wanted to do in my teenage years, to declaim my rebellion, something like this. I am going to do A, B, and C, and I don't care what they say. I never did that. But it feels good to do it today. Anyway, if I had done that, what would have happened is that some guy who happened to be at the same place at the same time, having experienced that, maybe somebody who didn't have my best interests at heart, doesn't make any difference, would probably have said, really? And that gesture would have been enough to collapse the entire house of cards as in a windstorm. And I would have been left blubbering. On reflection, I don't think I'll do that. The reason, of course, is that as a teenager and as an adult, I'm plagued with a hyperactive people-pleaser gene. Lincoln's rebellion as a teenager wasn't like that because he didn't declaim it. He just did it. He used words very sparingly. And that's probably one reason why his use of words was so overwhelming. But that's the topic of a different speech. When he was a teenager, he was rebellious in lots of ways. For example, unlike his contemporaries, he didn't smoke or chew tobacco. He didn't hunt or fish or use guns. He didn't fight. He didn't drink. Let me stop there with the drink to give you some of his mindset. He said he didn't drink because alcohol made him feel, quote, flabby and undone. And he didn't like that feeling of being out of control. The world spinning in a mindless vortex and so on. But he wasn't into abstinence as some non-drinkers are. You know the argument for abstaining from drink. You shouldn't drink. You shouldn't drink. And as arguments go, that's about the end of the argument. There's no real reason given. And I think the reason why he didn't become an advocate for, this messianic don't drink thing was because of the inherent feel he had for the one sin referenced in the Lord's Prayer. What are we asked? Forgive us our what? Trespasses. That for him to say you shouldn't drink is an infringement on that. It's an attack on your sovereignty. So he refrained from it. That's the mindset. There were some other things that he was rebellious about, where his contemporaries showed rank prejudice against African Americans and Native Americans. He refrained from that. They didn't move in the same circles, but he was still respectful for all that. Whereas contemporaries were for Andrew Jackson and the Democrats, he was for Henry Clay and the Whigs. Whereas contemporaries were contemptuous of what they called book larnin', he greatly valued the intellectual life. As he once said, "My best friend is the man who will lend me a book I haven't read yet." Where his contemporaries followed and had for eons, the son followed the career of the father. In his case, his father was a farmer and a carpenter. He chose instead to make his mark on the world in which he lived by the successful navigating of the labyrinth of his own mind. Whereas contemporaries were members of Christian denominations, 4 times as many people attended church on a regular basis on Sunday as voted in the 1860 election that put him in the White House. He pulled back from all of that. He would not join any religious denomination, although his practice, we haven't got time to go into it, although his life practice was Christian, he was never baptized, never joined any religious denomination. And I think the common denominator, the common thread to all of those choices that he made was a kind of steely determination. As a young man, he developed the ability that I didn't have to withstand somebody saying, "Really? You don't really mean that, do you?" He once said, "How many legs does a dog have if you count the tail a leg?" 4. Counting the tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. He learned as a young man to tear the guts out of a problem, not out of a person. Now, what's in it for you and me? Why should we care? So what? Interesting historical tidbits, meaning it's all pretty much DEAD. We should care because, given the obvious differences, I don't really think your teenage years and mine were any different from his. We all had to find our own way and establish our own territory What are we going to do with our lives? All of that. We all had to do that, he as well as us. We all had to face the challenge of moving from A to B, because A no longer fits. Everybody runs across that. And then B has to be left for C. And we have to figure out what C is. And I would suggest that the common denominator that he did that we should emulate is the lack of judgment. This abstaining from deciding what God himself is supposed to do, which is, you're this, and you're not going to wiggle off this hook. That's not my job to do. It's not your job to do either. And it certainly wasn't his. And the concomitant advantage that results from a refusal to pass judgment is a devastating clarity of vision. Because somewhere along the line, someone is going to say, let's slip this fifth leg in as a tail. And you have to say, thanks but no thanks. The world you live in demands it. Mr. Toastmaster.